I built a raised office in my workshop. It's raised to keep the dogs out, and so I can have easily accessible storage underneath. I've been using a janky old foldy table as my desk. This has always been temporary. It's time to build a real desk. I want to build one that spans the entire width, so I have lots of room to work. I also want to add a wireless QI charger for my phone, so I can set my phone on a spot on the desk, and it automatically starts charging. I've never built one of those before, so this is trial by fire. Many of the large projects I've built before are out of birch wood. That's what the living room mantle is made of, as well as the cat shelves and this bar cabinet. This wood looks great. It stains well and is super durable. So that's what I'm going to build my desk out of. I started by joining 2 boards together at a time. I lined up the boards, marked a few spots along the seam, and used a biscuit joiner to cut in holes at those marks. I made sure there was no dust in the grooves before adding glue, biscuits, and more glue. Because of how long these boards are, it was a little tricky getting them pressed together. But with the help of some bar clamps, I closed the seam and held them flat on the table. When the glue for that dried, I repeated it again with another pair of boards. Because my supply of pipe clamps is limited, I could only do one glue up at a time. I did it one more time, but this time I also had to have a seam in the middle because of the wood I was able to purchase. I just had to clamp it a little bit differently. I used a few boards clamped across the seam to keep it from cupping. I now have 3 pairs of boards glued up, and now it's time to start joining those to create a large slab. I ended up purchasing new H-style pipe clamps to make this glue up much easier. This raises the boards off the table, so I can use 2x4s on the underside as well as the top to make sure it stays flat. Now that I have a solid slab of wood all joined together, I can begin to whittle it down into the desk. It's much wider than it needs to be, so I used a drywall square to mark one edge. Just to make sure my line is square, I marked it from both sides. There's a bunch of excess glue sticking out of the seams, so I chiseled some of the larger chunks away. The next logical step is to take it outside and trim it to the right width. I raced it off the ground and cut the first edge. Then, based on the width of the office, I measured, marked, and cut the other edge. I'm really trying to get it to go from wall to wall. I kept the cutoffs because they'll be used for something else a little bit later. Alright, before I start getting too far into the process, I have to make sure it fits. I cleared my soon-to-be-gone desk and set the new slab right on top. It felt big, which is great because I'd like to have a lot of work surface. The office is small, but there was still plenty of room around the chair so I don't feel cramped. I set my laptop and phone on the slab to get a better feel of the space and figure out where I'd like to put the wireless phone charger. I'm a big fan of being surrounded by your work, so to implement that concept into my desk, I wanted to add a slight curve to the front edge. The tricky part is getting an even circle with a radius that is relatively subtle. I tied a string to my air compressor and kept moving it back until I was happy with the curve. I wrapped the string around a pencil to mark it, then cut it out with a jigsaw. I'd like to make a stand for my second monitor to comfortably sit above my laptop screen. I figured the easiest way is to make it out of the cutoffs from the slab. I set the monitor on the wood and marked an outline for the stand. I cut that out, then marked a second piece to cut. These 2 identical pieces will make the top and bottom of the stand. Next, I cut out the vertical pieces to connect the top and bottom. Since they're all from the same board, they will all be the exact same length. Before putting it all together, I sanded the surfaces really well. The stand went together pretty well. A few hiccups along the way, but I was able to work through them. I fastened it with glue and finish nails. When the glue was cured, I gave it a second sanding, this time softening the edges so there aren't any sharp corners. Next, I sanded the desk slab, starting with a low grit and working up to 220 grit. I spent a lot of time making sure the seams of the boards were smooth to the touch. Since I've been working in the office for a bit, I know how I'd like to arrange the desk, which means I know where I'd like to run the cables and punch holes at the back edge. When I tested how the desk fit in the office, I marked the spot of the QI charger with a small X. Now, on the underside, I traced the outline of the charger and the cable. Now I need to route out a space for the charger, but I need to get the wood as thin as I can without punching through. The closer that the charger is to the surface, the better it'll work. I used a scrap piece to test out the router and how well it cut so close to the other side. It looked good, so I got to work. I first cut about halfway down to remove a decent amount of material. Since this is on the underside, I wasn't worried about the shaky line of the wire channel. I adjusted the router bit to remove another layer of material. It was going good, and then it was going not so good. This was absolutely heartbreaking. I figured out that the router bit was slipping out of its hold, and it slipped down far enough to punch straight through the other side. By the looks of it, I may have just ruined my desk. It's not like I could just trim it out. This thing was right in the middle. I walked away for a bit to figure out how I could fix this problem. I'm a big advocate that everything happens for a reason. I can't change what happens, but I can learn from my mistakes and move forward with a positive attitude. So, let's Hakuna Matata this thing. I pulled out another piece of birch wood, traced a rough outline of the charger, and used the router again to carve it out, though not attempting to go as deep as before. I'm approaching this from a different direction. When I felt like I had worked the wood pretty thin, I gave it a test with the charger. Lo and behold, it didn't work. This was a very cheap QI charger, so maybe a high-powered one would work better. I picked up a Bellicon charger, and unlike the first one, my phone could recognize this charger. I let it sit for a while to see if it actually juiced up the battery or if it was just superficial. Within a span of time, it went from 14% to 28%. So, we're in business. The routed out space holds the charger, but for this solution, I need to make it a little bit larger. I routed out a bit more, but didn't worry about getting it as thin as the center area. Then I cut the larger circle out. I'm calling this thing the potato chip because it's thin like one. I didn't need the slab wood in this circle anymore, so I cut it out with a jigsaw. The plan is to inlay the chip into the surface of the desk, but I need to trim it down a bit. I pulled out a bunch of round things, mostly tape, and found a roll with a good circumference that's wider than the hole in the desk. I cut out the marked circle with a scroll saw. I brought the new circle chip back and traced its outline on the desk. I now need to remove a layer of material inside the circle, but I'm keeping the router as far away from the desk as I can. Instead, I'll use a combination of a Dremel, chisel, and a blade to carve it out. I'm bringing it down just enough so I can get a layer of the chip set in there. This step of the process took about an hour because I was so meticulous with removing just a little bit of material at a time and making sure my outer edge was perfect. Finally, the chip sat in the space really well, so I added a bunch of glue and pressed it in, and added a bunch of weight on top while the glue dried. Now that the chip was set in place, I brought it down level with the rest of the desk slab. There were a few small spots of chip out along the edge of the circle. so I used wood filler to fill in those spots. At the same time, I used filler on any imperfection spots on the seams of the slab. The channel for the power cable needed to be brought down just a hair. I used the Dremel for this. No more routers near the desk. Then I used some extra scrap pieces to figure out how to get this charger pressed into the surface of the desk. I'm not attaching anything yet, just dry fitting it in place. The wood filler was now cured, so I sanded it down smooth, bringing everything back to 220 grit. Now it's time to stain it. I spent a bunch of time making sure that all the dust was gone, and I was left with a clean, smooth surface. I chose to stain it a dark walnut color. I've used this color before, and am really happy with how it looks. I simply brush it on with a foam brush, let it sit for a bit, then wipe it off with rags and paper towels. While the top of the desk was drying, I stained the monitor stand. The next day, when the top of the desk was fully cured, I flipped it over and stained the bottom. I didn't bother staining the side or back edges because they'll be hidden against the wall, never to be seen. After another day of letting the stain cure, I flipped it back over and applied 4 coats of poly to the top of the desk and the monitor stand. This will really give it that finished look and make it durable to last a long time. The desk is done, so time to install it. I cleared out everything from the inside of the office and gave it a really thorough vacuuming. I spent a while trying to figure out what height the desk should be at. After some trials, I decided to put it at 28¼ inches high. I placed these L brackets so the top of the desk will be at that height. I think the standard height is about 30 inches, but a little bit shorter just works better for me. The reason I chose these brackets is so I can screw into the studs in the wall and into the underside of the desk. Nothing will be visible from my view of the desk. It'll appear to be floating. I put the desk in place and made a few minor adjustments to get it level. This thing looks really good. Before attaching the desk to the brackets, I wanted to make sure that the QI charger still worked well. It still works, which is a big relief because I don't know what I would have done if it didn't work. I then went ahead and attached the desk to the L brackets. Next, I wanted to add some support to the back edge. It's not really necessary, but can't hurt to have the extra stabilizers. I placed them so they screw into the studs behind the wall. I added felt pads to the bottom of the monitor stand, but realized I don't want it to slide around. The felt pads were really on there, so instead of scraping it up trying to get the felt off, I just added these clear rubber pads to the felt. This keeps it from sliding around. A much safer option for the thing holding up my monitor. I popped in some screws so I could attach this power strip to the wall. I plugged in the lights, which I'll go over in another video, and began the cable management. Then I started bringing my computer equipment back in and setting it up. It was pretty cool to see it all starting to come together. So I have my main laptop and a second monitor for it on the new monitor stand. Then I also have a second computer for typing scripts and watching the YouTubes. However, I ran into a little problem. The monitor for the second computer is old and has a plug that's larger than the hole I made for it. Oops. I'm not going to mess with the desk anymore, so I had to upgrade to a new monitor with an HDMI plug. The most important thing to add to the desk is this candy dispenser. This is the real reason why these videos are so good. Alright, this desk is done. It looks great, works great, is super sturdy, and is durable. Clearly, there are a few additions to the inside of the office. I'll go over those in the next video. This new setup is making my editing process much more efficient. The second monitor makes all the difference than just a single laptop screen. I've been working with this setup for a few months now, and it's working great. I spend a lot of time editing, so having a cool looking space makes it much more enjoyable. Okay, that's it for now. See ya. Really? Hi. Something in here. Mishap. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go. Bro. Excuse me, what are we doing? No, this way, go. This is why the office is raised up off the ground. These rascals.